All right, guys. Well, I'm going to give this another shot. We did it last time. It seemed to work out just fine. So this lecture, we're going to dive in on the spinal cord lecture. So this will be the second lecture of unit number 2. Before we get into talking about the actual spinal cord, I want to talk about how we protect it. With these structures, what we call meninges. Meninges are something actually we've discussed going back to the very first lecture of the semester when we discussed the different cavities of the body, like the cranial cavity where the brain is and the spinal cavity where the spinal cord is. We just mentioned it was like one little sentence, so obviously we're going to get into them in a lot greater detail right now. So reading through, the outer covering of our brain and spinal cord consists of bone. For the brain, it's the cranial bones. For the spinal cord, it's the vertebrae. We've talked about those various points in the semester. We're obviously very aware of that. The inner covering consists of membranes known as meninges. Now, the singular form of that term is meninx, but you'll never hear me call it that. Meninges is the term I use all the time, even if it's singular. I usually say meninge. There's 3 parts to the meninges, and they're listed here: dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. The dura mater, arachnoid mater is the order that they go from superficial to deep. So the dura mater is the outermost. And the second word in each of those terms, mater, actually translates to mean mother. So dura mater means actually tough mother. Arachnoid mater means spider mother, and we'll talk about why that is. And then the pia mater, pia means delicate, so that's the delicate mother. Looking here at the bottom of our picture here of the page, see an anterior view. So this is front of the spinal cord, and then those 3 meninges are kind of peeled away so that we can show them on the outside. And kind of the silverish color is the dura mater, then in the kind of purplish color is the arachnoid, and then this kind of coralish color is the pia mater. And talking about them, each is a little bit different. The dura mater is the tough membrane. As I mentioned, it's the tough mother, made up of dense irregular connective tissue, and it's surrounded by an epidural space, which you can't see here in this illustration, but you can actually see that down here. This is from a cadaver, looking at a transverse section of the spinal cord within the cervical region. So this would be up in the neck. Here's the cervical vertebrae that we've learned about on the outside, and then you can see a little thin space in there between it and that dura mater. That's the epidural space. And I imagine a lot of you have heard of an epidural before. Epidural is a procedure like a lady has before she gives birth, where they inject anesthetic in there to make childbirth not so terrible. That would be where that shot actually goes. So that's a pretty cool little piece of knowledge. But the epidural space is a space immediately superficial to the dura mater and deep to the vertebrae, where we find supporting cushion of fat and other connective tissues. The arachnoid mater is a thin avascular. Remember, avascular means that it doesn't actually receive blood flow. So it's covering cells and thin, loosely arranged collagen elastic fibers. And the reason it gets its name is because of the spider web's arrangement of delicate collagen elastic fibers. So there's the name spider mother. Between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater is a subdural space, and it contains interstitial fluid. Okay, that's what this arrow in our picture is showing. Okay, and then finally, the pia mater is the delicate mother. Here's the outer surface of the brain, or in this case, the spinal cord, which consists of thin squamous to cuboidal cells with interlacing bundles of collagen fibers and some fine elastic fibers. There's blood vessels that supply oxygen nutrients to the spinal cord here, and there's specialized structures called denticulated ligaments, which are triangular extensions of the pia mater that help support or suspend the spinal cord in the middle of what we call its dural sheath. And between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater is the subarachnoid space. Very important site because it contains sort of spinal fluid, fluid that we'll talk a little bit more about here in the next couple lectures. Provides support, protection, and is a reservoir for circulating fluids that our brain and spinal cord use to monitor our internal environment. Yeah. So you can see the 3 meninges. You can see the 2 spaces, subdural and subarachnoid. Once again, you can't see the epidural space, and then you can see the denticulated ligaments, these like white fibers here connecting to the spinal cord. what we can also see in this illustration, and we'll talk about them later in this lecture, are these spinal nerves emerging from the spinal cord at regular intervals, which relates to what we'll talk about here on this next page. Okay. So what we're going to look at on this page is kind of just an overall general external view structure of the spinal cord. Extends from our medulla oblongata, which is up in our brain, all the way down to the second lumbar vertebrae. If you think back to when we talked about the spinal column, we learned that our lumbar spine actually has 5 lumbar vertebrae, and then you've got the sacrum and the coccyx that also make up the spinal column. So that means that our spinal cord doesn't actually extend all the way down through the entirety of our spinal column. And it's roughly about 42 to 45 centimeters, 16 inches, and 18 inches in length. Obviously, that's dependent upon how tall we are. Each person will be obviously a little bit different. There are 2 enlargements of the spinal cord that exist, what we call a cervical enlargement up here in the cervical region of the spinal cord. In the cervical region, we know is our neck, and then a lumbar enlargement. Okay. The cervical enlargement is going to extend from the 4th cervical vertebrae to the 1st thoracic, and this is where the nerves to and from our upper limbs arise. And then the lumbar enlargement extends from the 9th to the 12th thoracic vertebrae, which seems kind of weird, but they call it the lumbar enlargement, although it's between the 9th and 12th thoracic vertebrae, but there's a specific reason to that. But this is where the nerves to and from our lower limbs arise, like the nerves to our legs. As you can see, we show those here on the left side of the page for the cervical plexus, or excuse me, the cervical enlargement. These nerves here listed on the brachial plexus would be what go to our arms, and then the lumbar enlargement is where these nerves that travel down into our legs travel or extend from. Inferior to the lumbar enlargement, the spinal cord terminates as what we call a conus medullaris, which is this kind of conical structure, which is why it's called a conus medullaris. Let's see. An extension of the pia mater extends inferiorly and fuses with the arachnoid mater and dura mater to anchor the spinal cord of the coccyx. That's called the filum terminale. That's shown down here at the very bottom. And then I'll also go ahead and talk about the cauda equina, which actually translates to mean horse's tail. And that's what it looks like, wisps of hair that extend down from the spinal cord through the rest of the spinal column. Like I said, spinal cord is shorter than the vertebral column, so this is going to extend down, and this is where nerves from the lumbar sacral and coccygeal regions of our spinal cord exit the spinal column. Let's talk about these things called spinal segments, which is what these abbreviations are here showing you on the right side of the image. The spinal cord itself is segmented, and if you think of it, I always think of it like a tube of cookies that you can buy at the store, and you just slice them off in thin segments. You can kind of do that same thing to the spinal cord, and associated with each of those spinal segments is a pair of spinal nerves. So there's 31 pairs. That means there's 31 segments to the spinal cord, and those spinal nerves are named for the spinal segments that they emerge from. So that's what C1 to S5, C5 to T1, all the way down to S4 represent. Okay. Now, we'll talk more about these nerves here later in the lecture, but for now, we'll kind of just leave it at that. Okay, that's the external anatomy. Now we'll talk about the internal anatomy. And we've seen a picture kind of like this in our last lecture where we talked about gray and white matter. We learned that the intersection of the spinal cord is kind of this capital H shape. That's due to the gray matter that's there, and that's surrounded by the white matter on the outside. Okay. We talked about gray matter as in appears gray because of the lack of myelin that's found in there. Not completely lack, there's probably a little bit of myelin, but just not a whole bunch. Instead, what takes place in the gray matter is very important. It's what we call the site of synaptic contact between neurons. And therefore is the site of synaptic integration or information processing. In this case, the central nervous system being specifically the spinal cord. When we talked about synapses last time, we learned that this is the site where one neuron releases neurotransmitters that can activate and act on a second neuron. So this is what we're talking about And we can actually see that here in our illustration between this blue neuron, which is a sensory neuron coming into the back, synapsing with this interneuron, and then we can actually see another synapse occurring with this red neuron. We can even see another neuron in there in the cell body and the axon extending out from the front side. And let's see, gray matter consists of cell bodies of neurons, neuroglia, also unmyelinated axons, and dendrites of those association, as we called them last lecture, interneurons and motor neurons. Overall, there's kind of a capital H shape, as I talked about, and we break it down into the two vertical lines of our H are what we call horns, or gray horns. As you can see, they're labeled here in our picture. There's a pair of posterior horns and then anterior horns, or you could replace posterior with dorsal, and anterior you could replace with ventral. Now, the way to tell them apart is to look out into the white matter and find this little sliver, which is always on the anterior side, and that sliver is called the anterior median fissure. It looks like somebody just took a piece of, or a knife and sliced right through the spinal cord. Since that's the anterior median fissure, that makes this whole segment of our spinal cord in this picture anterior, and that makes all of this posterior. So that can help you keep your head straight when trying to figure out the difference. And now, associated with those horns are roots of our spinal nerves. And I mentioned spinal nerves on the previous page. If I go back to this previous page, we once again see spinal nerves associated with the spinal cord. Just before attaching to the spinal cord, those spinal nerves fork and connect to the backside or posterior side of our spinal cord and the anterior side of our spinal cord. Those roots are called posterior roots and anterior roots. Okay? Inside of the posterior roots, you're going to find sensory neurons, which means that they're carrying signals coming into the spinal cord for sensations that we've talked about, like itch and tickle and hot and cold and pain and pressure and so on and so on and so on. Okay. The posterior root is where you find motor neurons, which are going to be the ones that carry the signals out. And in this case, we're showing a red motor neuron for the somatic nervous system, which means that it's going to be carrying signals to our skeletal muscles. Okay. In a certain segment of our spinal cord, we also find another pair of horns, what we call lateral horns or lateral gray horns, these little tiny bumps here on the side, which is where you find the cell bodies of autonomic motor neurons. These little bumps, these lateral horns, are only present between T1 and L1 vertebrae. And so that's kind of like the middle portion of our spinal cord. And if you think about it, you know, this region, general region of our spinal column is right there next to things like our lungs and our heart and our spleen and our liver and our intestines. And remember, those things are all controlled for us automatically. Okay? And remember, when you hear the term automatic, think autonomic. Okay? This is where these neurons are going to leave the spinal cord, carrying signals to our cardiac muscle, our smooth muscle, and our glands. Okay? There's one final segment of the gray matter that I want to talk about. This is what we call the gray commissure. This is the crossbar of our H. Now, this illustration doesn't show it, but sometimes signals come in, and more than likely not, sometimes most signals come into the spinal cord, and they don't just come right back out the same side. Okay? What we do is a lot of times signals go up the brain, which means that they have to sometimes cross over from one side of the spinal cord to the next. Sometimes they use the crossbar to then travel out to the white matter and use those white matter tracks, as we'll call them, to carry signals up and down. Okay? The center of the crossbar is what we call a central canal, which is a tiny little cavity that allows for circulating cerebrospinal fluid to travel up and down the spinal cord from our brain, and more so down than up. Okay? All right, the white matter has a bright white appearance, once again, because of the abundance of myelin, composed of bundles of axons and neurons called tracks, carrying signals from one part of the central nervous system to another. We talked about tracks at the end of the last lecture. Okay. I've already mentioned the first groove that I wanted to mention, which is the anterior median fissure, always found in the anterior side. That's found within a segment of the white matter, what we call the anterior white column. And There's also a posterior white column, which is where you find the posterior median sulcus, which is just a depression, not a sliver like you see here with the anterior median fissure. And then on the sides, the white matter is what we call lateral white columns. There's a lateral white column here. There's a lateral white column there. And now, within the white matter, and they're not shown, are sensory or ascending and motor or descending tracts. I always tell students to think of the tracks of the spinal cord like an elevator, which an elevator can do two things. It can go up and it can go down. Sensory or ascending tracts carry signals throughout the various places in the white matter up, whereas the motor descending carry the signals down. Pretty straightforward. When we're talking about up, we're talking about carrying those signals up to our brain. Because if you think about it, when you're itchy or something like that, that signal comes into your spinal cord. It then has to be transmitted up to your brain, where we actually are aware and have the ability to process that sensation. So then signals will go up the ascending tracts, and then if we want to scratch that itch, a signal is going to come down, and then it's going to go out all the way eventually to our skeletal muscles to allow us to scratch whatever it is that's itchy. And so that's kind of the situation within the internal parts of the spinal cord. This just happens to be the lumbar region, but you'd see the same thing in the thoracic and in the cervical regions as well. Okay, let's talk about nerves, which I've already been talking a lot about here on that previous page. And even in that first lecture, when we first learned that the peripheral nervous system is going to include 12 pairs of cranial nerves and then 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now, we'll talk more about the cranial nerves in the next lecture when we talk about the brain, because it makes sense. Those are attached to the brain. We'll talk about the spinal nerves right now and here on the next couple slides, since we're talking about the spinal cord. Now, regardless, definition of a nerve is just a cord-like organ composed of both sensory and motor neurons bound together by connective tissue that can transmit action potentials in opposite directions. Now, there's a lot of similarities to the structure of a nerve that we saw with the structure of skeletal muscle. Okay? If you think back to when we talked about skeletal muscles, we learned that muscles were subdivided into things called fascicles. We see fascicles in nerves, and fascicles were just bundles of muscle fibers, and a nerve, fascicle is a bundle of axons, because a singular nerve is going to consist of thousands upon thousands of axons from neurons. Okay? Now, when we talked about the structure of skeletal muscle, we talked about things like the epi, endo, and perimysium. This time we have an epi, peri, and an endoneurium. And these are connective tissues that just help to separate and kind of help keep that organization together with our entire nerve. The epineurium is the outer covering. It has extensions that actually occur between the fascicles. And the fascicles are surrounded by a perineurium, which is this kind of darker yellow that we can see surrounding each of these little bundles. Okay. And then the endoneurium is this yellow that's covering this myelinated axon. Okay. The endoneurium is therefore what surrounds each axon, as you can see here in this illustration. Down here at the bottom is a true picture of a nerve shown 1,000 times what we can see with the naked eye. You can see on the outside of the epi, you can see these little extensions and creating these little individualized sections. That's a fascicle. There's probably another one there and another one there. Okay, those are each surrounded by the perineurium. And then you can see the tiny little holes, if I zoom in far enough. Each of those little dark circular structures would be a neuron's axon, and surrounding it would be the endoneurium. Now, not necessarily do we see myelin surrounding an axon if we peel away that endoneurium, because as we know, not all neurons are myelinated. This one just happens to be myelinated though. What we also see back at the bottom of the page and in this illustration are that there are blood vessels found within the peri and epineuriums that help support and nourish those nerves, because they're living structures, living cells, just like pretty much anything else that we've been talking about this semester. All right, let's talk about those spinal nerves in greater detail. Once again, there's 31 pairs of them. They're designated by where they race in our spinal cord: 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccygeal. Some regions, axons from different levels of spinal cord can come together to form what we call plexuses, which then give rise to nerves that can be quite large because they contain axons from multiple spinal cord levels. If I go back to that what was this, the second picture, I guess, we look at just right up here what we call the cervical plexus. You can see these nerves coming off of the spinal cord, and even the brachial plexus is probably a little bit better. We show that like these two right here are coming together and they're creating this kind of web, and that's what a plexus is. And that plexus then is where the various nerves of the body branch off. Okay? So we'll talk about those different plexuses here in just a minute. But let's first talk about the setup of the spinal nerves. And like I was talking about, just before attaching to the spinal cord, they fork, creating these 2 different roots, anterior root and a posterior root. Okay? The anterior root is going to be loaded up with motor neurons, which means that the signals are leaving the spinal cord, and that means that they can be stimulated by either sensory neurons or interneurons. Okay? And the stimulation of these motor neurons allows for motor control by upper motor neurons, which are interneurons that are actually located back up in the brain, as well as allowing for things like reflexes, like when you touch something hot and you remove your hand from it, or when you tap on a patellar tendon, that kind of stuff. And the somatic motor neurons that extend from the spinal cord are called lower motor neurons, and that's because they are, lower than the uppers. Simple as that. And posterior root is composed predominantly of sensory neurons carrying signals in, okay, where they then synapse with motor and interneurons in the spinal cord. Okay. If I go back to this illustration, there's a segment of that posterior root I didn't really touch on, but that's called a posterior or dorsal root ganglion. And inside of that is where you'd find the cell body, or cell bodies, because you're going to have thousands of them, of these sensory neurons. If you think back to the last lecture, we learned that most sensory neurons are unipolar in structure, which means that the cell body is off to the side. So if you've got thousands of neurons, all of the cell bodies off to the side, kind of in the same general area, it's going to cause this area to be a little bit fatter. And that's what this posterior or dorsal root ganglion is. We can see here and here on the sides of our picture. Okay. Now, when leaving the spinal column, the posterior and the anterior roots come together and form the singular spinal nerve, and we can see that really nicely right here with a lot less arrows in the way. But pretty much right after leaving the spinal column, we see those roots, or that singular spinal nerve branch, and we call those rami. Rami is plural for ramus. Okay. And there's 2 major ones, the posterior and the anterior. Of the 2, the anterior is by far and away larger than the posterior. Okay. The posterior travels to the back side of the body, to the posterior side of the body, and innervates nerves and muscles of the skin and muscles on the posterior surface of our head, neck, and trunk. Whereas the bigger of the 2, the anterior ramus, serves muscles and structure of our upper and lower limbs, as well as the skin and lateral and anterior surface of our trunk, except in the, there should be a period there. Except in the thoracic region, the anterior rami of spinal nerves branch and anastomose or merge repeatedly on both sides of the body to form nerve plexuses. Like I said, those are where those eventual nerves come off. 5 principal nerve plexuses exist: cervical, brachial, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. And we'll talk about those and see those in greater detail here on the next couple slides. Okay. There's also a meningeal branch, which re-enters the vertebral cavity to supply the vertebrae, as well as vertebral ligaments, the blood vessels, and those meninges. Okay. You can see that here. It's very small. And then there's also what we call rami communicantes, which are shown here. These 2 that are connecting to sympathetic ganglion. We'll talk about sympathetic ganglion here at the end of the lecture, components of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, let's talk about the cervical plexus. This is what supplies the skin and muscles of our head, neck, and superior portions of our shoulders, as as the chest, and that muscle that we've talked a little bit about at various points, the diaphragm. The plexus is formed from the first 4 cervical nerves, C1 through C4, with contributions from C5. It's one on each side of the neck, alongside the first 4 cervical vertebrae, and there's several superficial and deep nerves arising from the cervical plexus. Included are these nerves, and what I've done with this table is included what they do as far as sensory innervation goes. So that would mean that they're carrying signals into the spinal cord. And then for motor innervation, which means that they're carrying signals away from the spinal cord. Okay, what I would expect you guys to know would just be, which ones are part of the cervical plexus. With the exception, I do want you to know quite a bit more, and it's not quite a bit, it's mainly this last one. The phrenic nerve is super, super important, and that's because it innervates our diaphragm, and so without it, we would not be able to breathe. Okay? Now, down here at the bottom of the page, we can see the spinal nerves, and then the green portion of the picture is showing you the plexus, that kind of webbing, and then we can see the beginning of the nerves coming off. A textbook doesn't have illustration to really show them very well, so I've included a picture that you can draw or color on. You can't see all of them, but we can see the greater auricular, the lesser occipital, the transverse cervical, and the supraclavicular. Now, if you think back to when we've talked about body parts and those special names for them, we've talked about the occipital region being the back of your skull. Okay, which is this nerve here. So if you were to color it, it would be all of this down to this point. Okay, we haven't talked about the ear too much, but the fancier term for your external ear is your auricle, and that's what this nerve is almost attached to. We know that the cervical region of our body is the neck, and that the word transverse means coming across. So this nerve here coming across the neck is the transverse cervical. And then the biggest one, which is actually labeled, is 3 parts, medial, intermediate, and lateral, what we call the supraclavicular nerve. And so if you were to color that, it would be all of this big one here. Okay, that's the cervical plexus. Let's move on to the brachial plexus, which supplies our shoulder and upper limbs. It's formed from the anterior ventral rami of C5 through C8 and then T1. There's quite a bit more complexity to this branching. When those different nerves come off of the spinal cord, they come together and form trunks. Sorry, that's my 4-year-old son helping to teach me right now, or teach with me, I should say. There's 3 trunks. There's an upper trunk, which is formed from roots C5 and C6. And there's an upper trunk, which is, there's a middle trunk, C7 is what contributes to that, and then C8 and T1 converge to form the lower trunk. They then divide and form divisions, okay, which are shown here in kind of this light greenish color, okay, and then we have what are called cords, okay, and from those cords, the lateral, posterior, medial cords, the following nerves arise. Now, with the cervical plexus, we saw some that were only sensory, some that were only motor. With the rest here, we're going to see both sensory and motor. So, cervical plexus is a little bit unique in that retrospect. Okay. Looking at them on the next page, you can basically, break them down to what they are, or their name for where they're going. We know that the axillary region of our body is the armpit. Okay, well, that's where you find the axillary nerve, but it actually is what extends out here to innervate kind of the lateral portion of our shoulder up there, kind of where our deltoid is. The ulnar nerve runs down that medial side of our arm, down the ulna and into our hand, and it innervates some of our medial fingers, the pinky, the ring, and then our middle finger. And whereas go back up here to it. This median nerve runs down the middle, and it's going to innervate our thumb and index. as well as the radial nerve, which runs down the radius, so from the lateral side, thumb side. And you can see there are different branches, like the deep and superficial branches. It's really kind of hard to tell them apart. And see, did I miss any? Musculocutaneous, if we didn't mention that one. Musculocutaneous. It's this one right here. It's running down, and then it kind of terminates somewhere right in here in the forearm, just before the wrist. So that's the various nerves of our arms. And lumbar plexus is the next plexus, supplies the anterolateral abdominal wall, external genitalia, parts of the lower limbs, formed from the roots of L1 through L4. But unlike the brachial plexus, there's a lot less branching going on. And nerves that are part of the lumbar plexus are shown here on this next, or in this table, and you can see a lot of them are going to have sensory and motor innervations. Okay. Down here at the bottom, or the next page, we can see them, and I believe most of them have been bolded for us. And we can see an anterior view and a posterior view. This would be the upper leg. We have the iliohypogastric up here, right by where our lower parts of our torso would be, kind of what we call like our love handles. Same thing for the ilioinguinal, getting a little bit more down towards our hip. Okay. Let's see, genitofemoral, remember, think genitals, so anterior parts and very medial, which, genitalia will be kind of right in here. And that's where this nerve's kind of right there. On the previous page, I had it listed as the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve. This is listed here as lateral cutaneous nerve of the thigh. Same thing, it runs down lateral side of our thigh or femoral region, and it stays fairly superficial and hits our skin, which is where the term cutaneous comes from. Let's see, the obturator nerve, that's the nerve here that runs down, and it runs through that big hole that we learned about here a few weeks ago, the obturator foramen, biggest hole in our skeleton. And then there's also this femoral nerve, which we can see in both pictures, which is more of an anterior nerve, so that's why I'm pointing to it over here. You don't want to confuse that with this big one, which is your sciatic nerve that I'll talk about right now. Okay. On this next page, we're going to combine and talk about the sacral and coccygeal plexuses together, which supply our butt, perineum, and lower limbs, formed by the roots of spinal nerves L4 through L5, and then S1 down to S4. Coccygeal would be just S4 and S5, and included are these nerves. Now, also, I wanted to point out the sciatic nerve, which is the biggest nerve of the body, put in parentheses tibial and common fibular, and that's because it forks, and these are the branches that come off of it. And now, we can see just how big that is here on this picture at the bottom of the page, and we can see it, and we saw the same thing on that picture a couple of slides ago. The only difference between this picture and the picture that was a couple of slides ago is that we now extend all the way down into the toes. Okay. I'll go ahead and talk about that sciatic nerve and how it branches to form the tibial and then the common fibular, and those run down the tibia and the fibula respectively. Now, something that we'll talk about when we get into blood vessels is the fact that the word common means that there's going to be a branch coming off of it. And we can see that branch here, and one is the deep fibular nerve and the other is the superficial fibular nerve. And we'll see the same thing for things like the common carotid, which is an artery in our neck that branches and forms into an external and internal carotid artery. We'll get to that here in a few lectures, not this unit or the next unit though. Okay, let's talk about the nerves back up here by the hips, which include the gluteal nerves. There's a superior, there's an inferior. Those are going to innervate our glutes, our butt muscles, as we know what those are. There's pudendal nerve. Pudendal, you can see here, it kind of comes around and towards our genitalia, and that's what it is known for innervating: penis, scrotum in men, labia majora minorum, vagina in females, so on and so forth. Posterior cutaneous, let's see, it's right down here, very small nerve. It's got a lot of branches to it though. But those are the nerves of the sacral and coccygeal plexus. Okay, switching gears here. We'll talk now about dermatomes. Down here at the bottom of the page, pretty cool picture. It's a very complicated picture. If you notice, the body's been segmented up, and each of the segments is labeled with a different abbreviation, T12, C6, etc., etc. Those are illustrating the fact that the skin over the entire body is innervated by a specific nerve or set of nerves. When you think that there's two sides of the body, and for example, the back of our skull, top of our skull, is innervated. That skin is innervated by C2, cervical spinal nerves number 2. And why this is important as well, to think about when you see in movies and TV shows when somebody's like paralyzed or something like that, they're doing tests like rubbing on the bottom of the foot or poking at someone to see if they can feel that sensation. This is an illustration, a practical illustration of the importance of knowledge of dermatomes, how we know that each segment of our skin is served by a specific predictable segment of our spinal cord and thus a spinal nerve. And that's what this illustration is showing. Now, there is one exception to the rule, and that's our face, which is not innervated by a spinal nerve, but instead is innervated by trigeminal nerve, which is a nerve of our, it's a cranial nerve, so it's one of the 12 that we'll talk about in the next lecture. Okay, let's just briefly kind of talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system, which is the division of our nervous system that's associated with automatic control of our cardiac muscle, our spleen muscle, and our glands. I'm going to talk about motor aspects of it, which means that we're talking about the signals leaving the brain and spinal cord, going to those various organs that are controlled automatically. But with any response in the body, whether it's moving your hand off of a hot stove or right, hang on one second, guys, I'm going to pause. Okay, sorry about that. Crisis averted, hopefully. Okay, so what I was talking about was the fact that we always have a response, which means that there must be an input. In the case of the autonomic nervous system, input comes from what we call autonomic sensory neurons, which are located in our interior within organs. So that's why we call them interoceptors, found in places like our blood vessels, monitoring our blood pressure and our blood acidity and the chemical concentrations of oxygen and glucose and so on and so on and so on. Yeah. Those provide us with the input, and then our brain processes that information, decides what to do with it, and has a response, which activates the two divisions of our nervous system, or one of the two, either the sympathetic, which we learned is going to produce a fight or flight response, or the parasympathetic, which produces a rest and digest response. Okay. Now, unlike the somatic motor neurons that extend from our central nervous system all the way to the skeletal muscles that they innervate, most autonomic motor neurons, most autonomic motor pathways consist of two neurons placed in series. Okay, well, on the left here we show the parasympathetic leaving our brain by way of these cranial nerves. You can see the first neuron, what we call a preganglionic neuron, leaves the brain, or if we're looking down here, the spinal cord, and then it synapses with the second neuron, what we call a postganglionic neuron. Where they meet, right here as I circle it with my cursor, is what we'd call autonomic ganglion. Now with the parasympathetic nervous system, just a second, buddy. With the parasympathetic nervous system, the innervation takes place, or the synapses take place right between, or right next to the organs that we're innervating. Whereas with the sympathetic nervous system, a lot of times the synapses occur within these chains or trunks that are located, and it doesn't show it here, but they're found on both sides of our spinal column. Now, what we don't show in this illustration is the second one, that would be right here, but we also don't show the the spinal column, the vertebrae, because that would just interfere with the ability to see the spinal cord. And a lot of times that synapse takes place right inside of that chain, okay? And we can even carry signals up and down the chain so that, when we leave the spinal cord at T1, we can carry the signals up towards our neck to innervate things in our head. And so that means that the first neuron is typically really short, the preganglionic neuron, and the second is really long, which is the inverse of the parasympathetic, which is going to be long and then short. Okay? Other than that, there's also the difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic with regards to which part of the spinal cord and brain are involved. With sympathetic output, the brain and the cranial nerves are not involved. All we use is T1 down through L2. Now, if we go back all the way to this picture, we talked about these lateral horns, which we said were only found between T1 and L1 vertebrae. Well, now you know why. Okay? Because those are where the motor neuron cell bodies are located for the sympathetic nervous system. Okay? A nickname for the sympathetic is the thoracolumbar division. Okay? Whereas another term to describe the parasympathetic is the craniosacral division, and that's because it uses 4 pairs of cranial nerves and then the sacral region of our spinal cord. And other than that, that's pretty much the gist of the illustration and the information. I know I didn't read through, but I did, talk about all of it. Now, just like what we talked about for the other spinal nerves in places like our cervical region and our upper shoulder area where the brachial plexus is, in our thorax, abdomen, and pelvis, we see autonomic plexuses, which is due to axons from both sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons kind of tangling up, and many of which are located alongside major arteries like the aorta that we show here, even the renal arteries, which are big ones, and down into our kind of almost hip area with the common iliac arteries. Now, examples of them would be the thorax or of the thorax would be the cardiac and pulmonary plexuses. Cardiac would be right there. Your heart would be located here, but it's been removed. Cardiac, as we know, always refers to heart, and that's right where that plexus is. Pulmonary, we know that is always associated with that term. The lungs would be right here and here. And then down in our abdomen are the plexuses, celiac, superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric, hypogastric, and renal plexuses, all named for various reasons, but I won't get into that. Okay, well, then I will call it there. Thanks, guys.